Heng, a laundress from Yong'an Alley, had taken a huge fall in her previous life. Now that she's been given a second chance, she just wants to live a quiet, peaceful life and stay far away from the people of the Meng family. But that poor scholar, Helan Jin, whom she had left behind in that dilapidated hut, clung to her ankle and wouldn't let go. "Hey, Heng, why are you running away?" Aunt Zhou asked from the mouth of the alley. Heng looked down at the old scar on her wrist and recalled what Helan Jin had said when he pressed the jade pendant into her hand at the palace banquet. "Tomorrow at the bridgehead, the porridge will be thick." She didn't answer Aunt Zhou. She just tucked the wooden comb into her bosom and set off toward the bridgehead. In this life, no one is going to stop her from drinking that bowl of thick porridge. Main text. You just said, again. My throat had a taste of rust, and a breathy sound squeezed out from my constricted vocal cords, as hoarse as sandpaper scraping against rough wood. I didn't raise my hand to rub it. With my back pressed against the wall, the dampness from the wall seeped into the back of my spring jacket, sending a fine layer of goosebumps across the nape of my neck. The man in front of me was still in the same position as before, leaning forward slightly, his palm hovering 3 inches from my neck, his knuckles slightly curled, as if he hadn't yet recovered from the force of his earlier grip. Moonlight seeped through the torn window paper, casting one side of his face in a pale glow while the other remained shrouded in shadow. His eyes were deep and dark, the pupils nearly swallowing the whites of his eyes whole. Helan Jin looked at me with his eyes cast down. After a moment, he tilted his head slightly, as if pondering something strange. "I already said so," he said, his voice low and even, betraying no emotion. "So what if I said it again?" His reply was so offhand, as if he were just brushing off an insignificant question. But I knew that wasn't the case. Just now, when he pinned me against the wall, the force with which his knuckles dug into the sides of my shoulder blades made it clear he intended to nail me there. When he asked, "You want to abandon me again?" he emphasized the word again with particular intensity, as if grinding it out from between his teeth. If he had memories of a past life, he would never let that word slide so easily. "Not really," I said, lowering my eyes to avoid his gaze and fixing my stare on the tips of my shoes. There was a tear there, and the cotton filling peeking through had turned gray from the damp. "It just sounds strange. When have I ever abandoned you?" As soon as the words were spoken, the room fell silent for a moment. At some point, the sound of the butcher next door chopping bones had stopped. A draft caused the flame of the oil lamp hanging from the eaves to waver slightly, and the shadows of the 2 people on the wall flickered in response. Helan Jin stood right there in that flickering pool of light, motionless. "That's true," he said. He straightened up and took half a step back. The distance between us was slightly greater than before, but I still felt that the tension surrounding him hadn't completely dissipated. He was like a beast that seemed docile but could pounce at any moment. "The porridge is on the table." He tilted his chin slightly, pointing to the square table, which was missing a leg and propped up with roof tiles. "I'll go heat it up." He turned and walked toward the stove. His pace was neither hurried nor slow, and as he reached for the half bowl of plain congee on the table, his silhouette actually bore a certain resemblance to the timid and hesitant Helan Jin from his past life. I stared at the back of his neck. The scar was still there. Light brown, about 2 inches long, it ran diagonally across his cervical vertebrae, like a curled-up centipede. In his past life, when he was being chased and beaten by the Meng family's servants, he had hit his head on the stone steps. Blood had streamed down his neck, soaking half his collar. At that moment, I stood beside Meng Jingxing, watching the trail of blood wind its way down. My throat tightened, but in the end, I said nothing. "The wound on the back of your neck," I said. "How did you get it?" His hand holding the bowl paused for a moment. It was just that brief moment. It was so fleeting that if I hadn't been staring at him the whole time, I almost would have missed it. "I fell," he said, without turning around, his voice as usual. "I don't remember it, I was just a kid. I rolled down the steps and hit my head. I fell. On the steps. When I was a kid." While she was alive, Helan Jin's adoptive mother, Mrs. Sun, never once mentioned that he had fallen down the steps as a child. In my previous life, I lived with him in Yong'an Alley for 3 years. One summer day, as he was chopping wood bare-chested in the courtyard, I saw that scar and asked him about it once. At the time, he lowered his head, his ears flushed bright red, and after stammering for a long while, he still couldn't give me a clear explanation. Until the day he died, he never told me the story behind that scar. But he had answered so fluently just a moment ago. It was so smooth, as if I'd rehearsed it countless times in my mind. Aunt's son never mentioned it, I said. She's gone, he said, turning around with his bowl in hand, his face blank and expressionless. Why are you asking? The fire in the hearth hadn't caught yet, and the room was lit only by that oil lamp. He stood with his back to the light, the contours of his features sharply defined by the shadows. I looked at that face, the same eyebrows and eyes as in my past life, yet I could no longer find even a trace of his former timidity and cowering. It was only then that the last shred of hope I had clung to was completely extinguished. He knows. He knew the origin of that scar, because in this lifetime he hadn't yet reached the point of being chased and beaten by the Meng family servants. The only person who could use words like staircase, childhood, and fall was Helan Jin, who had returned with memories of his past life. Just asking. I looked away and bent down to pick up the wooden comb that had fallen to the ground when I bumped into it. Just as my fingertips touched the comb's teeth, a hand reached over from the side and picked up the comb before I could. I looked up. He was already right in front of me. He'd moved so quickly that I hadn't heard his footsteps. He looked down at the boxwood comb in his hand, ran his fingertips over the section where 2 teeth were missing, and suddenly smiled. The smile was fleeting, a faint twitch at the corners of his mouth, like a crack forming on the ice in winter. That silver hairpin you pawned, he said, was the one I bought for you on your birthday last year. He looked up. It cost me 3 months' tuition to buy it. How many coins did you get for it? That taste of rust suddenly welled up in my throat again. A silver hairpin. He said, a silver hairpin. On the day I left Yong'an Alley in my past life, I did indeed pawn this hairpin for 80 to cover my travel expenses. But that was in my past life. In this life, I haven't reached that point yet. Helan Jin gripped the other end of the comb and gently pushed it toward me. His fingertips brushed against mine, and that fleeting touch was so hot I almost pulled my hand away. Heng. He called my name, his voice dropping so low it sounded like he was talking to himself. You just said you never abandoned me. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Then tell me, who is this letter, the one tucked under the comb, addressed to? I followed his gaze. That blue-papered letter slipped out of the bundle I'd just pulled down, half of it sticking out from the foot of the bed. The envelope bore no return address, only a seal of red wax that sealed it tightly. The Meng family's plum blossom crest was printed on it. The wax seal is still intact. But I know that, as far as he's concerned, it's already been opened once. In my past life, I walked out the gate of Yong'an Alley with this letter tucked away. Moonlight streamed diagonally through the broken window, illuminating the plum blossom emblem in sharp detail. As Helan Jin's gaze fell upon it, the smile on his face slowly faded, leaving only an expression as still as the water in a pond. Then he let go of the comb. No rush, he said. Have some porridge first. He turned and walked toward the stove, speaking as if he were simply remarking that the weather was nice today. But the moment I saw him turn away, I noticed his right hand was clenched tight, his knuckles white. The flames in the stove licked at the bottom of the pot, and the porridge bubbled gently, making a gentle gurgling sound. Helan Jin was crouched with his back to me in front of the stove, using fire tongs to stir the ashes. His movements were as calm and deliberate as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. But I noticed that on the hand he was using to add firewood to the firebox, 2 knuckles still bore faint white marks that hadn't faded yet, left behind when he'd clenched his fist moments earlier. I sat on the edge of the bed without looking at the letter. That blue-papered letter lay on the bundle at the foot of the bed, its wax seal still intact. The Meng family's plum blossom crest shimmered with a dusky silver glow in the moonlight. In my previous life, I opened it to find a note written in Meng Jingxing's own hand, saying that a carriage had been prepared at the west corner gate and instructing me to pack my personal belongings and leave Yong'an Alley before dawn, after which I would never need to return. That day had not yet come in this lifetime, yet Helan Jin had already seen it. There was a moment of silence over by the stove. "Why don't you go take a look?" He didn't turn around. His voice came through the crackling of the fire in the stove. "The wax seal hasn't been broken yet." "What are you looking at?" I said. "A letter that hasn't even reached me yet." Helan Jin suddenly let out a low chuckle. The laughter was soft, muffled deep within her chest, softened by the heat rising from the stove. But to my ears, what lay beneath that laughter felt heavy, like a pot sitting over a low flame ready to boil over at any moment. He stood up and walked over carrying that chipped earthenware bowl. The porridge had cooled slightly. The grains of rice had swollen a bit since earlier, but it was still so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl. He set the bowl on the table next to me. He didn't hand it to me, but just left it there. "The letter said that someone from the Meng family had come looking for you," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, as if he were describing something he'd seen on the street that day. "They brought a message for you." I looked up at him. He stood by the table, looking down at me from above. Moonlight streamed in from the side, casting a cool, crisp glow on the right side of his face, while the left side remained blurred in the shadow cast by the letter. As he spoke, the corners of his mouth even turned up slightly, as if he were talking about something that had nothing to do with him at all. "How do you know what's in the letter?" I asked. He didn't answer. He simply looked down at the letter, his gaze as if he were looking at something that was already completely dead. "I didn't open it," he said after a moment. He spoke those words very slowly, as if trying to convince himself. I curled my fingers into the palm of my hand and pinched it gently with my fingernails. Helan Jin's remark just now was less of an answer and more like a door being shut in my face. He clearly knew what was written in the letter, because he'd already read it once. Yet he said, "I haven't opened it," because he'd never opened it in his life. Both he and I understood the subtext behind those words, but neither of us could bring ourselves to spell it out. "Since it hasn't been opened," I said, "it must be a letter that hasn't been delivered yet." I lifted the bowl of porridge and took a sip. The rice broth slid down my throat, warming the spot where I'd just been choked. The porridge was so bland it was almost tasteless, and there were pitifully few grains of rice in it. "I'm going to the docks tomorrow to look for work," I said. He paused for a moment. "The pier?" "Whether it's washing and mending clothes or unloading cargo, I've got to earn some money to make ends meet." I poked at the few grains of rice in my bowl with my chopsticks. "You've spent all the tuition money you've earned these past few months on combs for me. How are we going to put food on the table from now on?" What I said sounded ordinary, as if I were recounting some everyday trifle. But I knew he was listening. He had been listening the whole time. Helan Jin stood motionless by the table, his gaze shifting from my face to the bowl of porridge, then back to my face. The way he looked at me was different from the timid, meek Helan Jin of my past life. In my past life, he would have frantically waved his hands, saying, "No, no, it's not necessary." He would have pushed the few grains of rice in his bowl over to me, drinking only the watery broth himself, and then, with his ears turning red, claimed he wasn't hungry. But for now, he was just watching me, his gaze heavy, as if he were trying to gauge just how much of what I just said was sincere. "I'll set up a stall at the bridge tomorrow and save you a spot," he said after a moment. "Aunt Zhou said they need a laundry worker over at the West Market. If you go there, mention my name." He picked up the conversation so naturally, as if that letter between us, sealed with plum blossom patterned lacquer, had never existed. But I noticed that when he said, "Give my name," there was something indescribable in his voice, as if a weight had been lifted, as if he'd come to some firm conclusion. The last embers in the stove burst with a crackle, sending sparks flying. As night fell, Yong'an Alley grew quiet. The butcher next door had put away his knife, and the night watchman at the entrance of the alley had struck the third watch. The sound of the wooden block echoed faintly from afar, muffled and distant. Helan Jin draped his thin quilt over the bench, lay on his side with his back to the bed and his face toward the wall, his back hunched, the outline of his spine protruding, vertebra by vertebra, beneath the coarse cotton sheet. Just like in his previous life. I watched his back. The old scar on the nape of his neck was illuminated by the moonlight streaming in, casting a faint shadow. Helan Jin. He didn't move, but his breathing faltered for a moment. I could tell. You just said that someone from the Meng family came to see me with that letter, I said. What did the person from the Meng family look like? How do you know they were from the Meng family? The figure on the bench froze for about 2 breaths. Then he rolled over onto his back and lay staring at the crooked rafters on the ceiling. Moonlight glided across his face, making his dark eyes look dewy, yet beneath that glistening surface there was nothing, like a well covered with a thin layer of ice on a winter night. On that handkerchief tucked under your dressing table, he said, there's a plum blossom pattern from the Meng family. I saw it when I was wiping down the table. He paused for a moment. Someone from the Meng family came by and knocked on the door twice, but you weren't home. I asked the visitor, and he said he was delivering something on behalf of young Master Jingxing. He spoke those few sentences so smoothly that they sounded genuine. But as I listened, a string in my heart was plucked. It trembled and hummed. His tone was far too calm when he mentioned Meng Jingxing. He seemed as indifferent as if he had nothing to do with that man. Yet in a past life, I saw with my own eyes the pool of blood that flowed when Meng Jingxing sent his servants to chase and beat him, and he fell and broke the back of his neck. Young Master Jingxing. I repeated those 4 words, set the bowl back on the table, stood up, and walked over to the window, turning my back to him. I haven't met many people from the Meng family, but you sure have a good memory. That gaze from behind felt like a string tied to my back, light as a feather, yet I knew the other end of that string was pulled tight. It wasn't until much later, so long that I thought he had already fallen asleep, that I heard the sound of him sitting up on the bench. Su Heng. He called my name, his voice so soft it was like a piece of paper falling onto the water. I didn't turn around. Tomorrow I'll set up my stall at the bridgehead, and you'll be washing clothes at the West Market, he paused. Don't go to the docks, it's chaotic over there. You finished all the porridge. You didn't save those few grains of rice at the bottom of the bowl for me. His final words were spoken with a faint hint of a smile in his voice, as if he were talking to himself. I turned my face toward the window. Moonlight shone on the bluestone pavement of Yong'an Alley. In the distance, at the entrance to the alley, a blurry shadow was moving, as if someone were quietly attaching something to the base of the wall in the dead of night. I didn't tell Helan Jin that I had seen it. By the well in the West Market, I squatted and scrubbed clothes for 2 days. At noon on the 3rd day, the small palanquin with blue curtains from the Meng family's mansion came to a stop at the entrance to the alley. The curtain of the palanquin parted, and a maidservant wearing a peach-pink jacket stepped out. She held her chin high, scanned the laundry stall with her eyes, and finally fixed her gaze on my face. Are you Su Heng? Without looking up, I wrung out the shirt I was holding and placed it in the wooden basin. My young mistress has a question for you. Behind the maid was an elderly woman, broad-shouldered and stocky, who planted herself in front of the stall, blocking out half the light in the alley. The maid pulled a letter from her sleeve. The paper had a faint scent of sandalwood, and the folds were neat. She didn't hand it to me, but simply held it in her hand and waved it slightly. The young lady said that as a laundry worker, you're not worthy of receiving an invitation from the Meng residence. Just pass along the message. The Meng residence is hosting a spring banquet the day after tomorrow, and they'd like you to attend. A few women washing clothes nearby exchanged glances. Aunt Zhou kept her voice low, but everyone could hear her clearly. The Meng family's spring banquet? Isn't that for the young ladies of various families? What would a laundry woman be doing there? The maid overheard this and gave a slight smirk. The young lady said to go. Dress appropriately, don't bring shame to the Meng family. With that, she tossed the letter into my laundry basin. The corner of the paper became damp, and a small smudge of ink spread out. The old woman snorted, then turned and walked away with the maid. The small palanquin with its blue curtains was lifted, and it clattered off into the distance. I fished the piece of paper out of the water. The water stains had blurred some of the characters, but I could faintly make out the signature, Wantang. Meng Wantong. That imposter who assumed Helan Jin's identity and enjoyed 16 years of luxury. Aunt Zhou leaned in, a worried look on her face. Heng, that young lady from the Meng family is no pushover. A few days ago, the daughter of manager Liu from the fabric shop on East Street offended her, and the very next day, someone smashed up the shop. What's your beef with her? Nothing's wrong. I folded the letter and slipped it into my sleeve pocket. She probably mistook me for someone else. I didn't tell the truth. Meng Wantong came to see me because of Helan Jin. In my previous life, she had heard from somewhere that Helan Jin and I were acquainted, so she specifically invited me to the spring banquet. In front of all the noble young ladies in attendance, she pointed at my soiled apron and laughed. You dare to attend a banquet looking so shabby? You really are a commoner, you have no sense of propriety. At that moment, I was so embarrassed my face turned bright red. I just wanted to sink into the ground. She's pulling this stunt again, but this time I'm not planning to sink into the ground. As I was packing up for the evening, I walked back home carrying a wooden basin. At the corner of the alley, Helan Jin was sitting on a low stool, writing letters for people. The paper and ink in front of him were neatly arranged. When he saw me coming back, his pen paused for a moment. I'm finishing up early today. A note has arrived from the Meng family. I pulled the letter, one corner of which was damp, from my sleeve and placed it on the corner of his desk. It's an invitation to the spring banquet the day after tomorrow. He glanced down at the piece of paper. When his gaze fell on the characters Wantang, his face remained expressionless. He simply set down his brush and tapped the edge of the table twice with his index finger, lightly, quickly, as if counting something. Are you going? He asked. Go. He looked up at me. The evening light from the end of the alley fell on him from behind, casting half his face in a dim, yellow glow while the other half was plunged into shadow. Something flashed in his eyes. It happened so quickly that I couldn't make it out. All right, he said, picking up the sheet of paper from the table, folding it in half, and tucking it into his sleeve pocket. Then I'll go with you. No male guests were invited to the Meng family's spring banquet. I'm on somewhat friendly terms with Meng Jingxing, he said, the corners of his mouth curving ever so slightly. He owes me a few favors, enough to land me a job as a doorman. I didn't ask what kind of relationship they had. Just as he didn't ask me why I was going. Early the morning after tomorrow, Helan Jin produced a slightly worn lotus pink silk dress from somewhere. The fabric was silk, and though not particularly expensive, it was clean and well pressed. As he handed it to me, he glanced away, looking elsewhere. I borrowed them, he said. They belong to Aunt Zhou's niece. They've been washed and starched, they're clean. I took it and changed my clothes. The face reflected in the bronze mirror was still the same, but with the change of clothes, my demeanor was quite different. Helan Jin stood outside the door and asked through the door, "Are you done yet?" His voice was flat, as if he were just asking offhand. All right. He pushed open the door and walked in, glancing briefly at me before quickly looking away. Today, too, he was wearing a slightly worn indigo blue straight-cut robe. His hair was neatly tied back, and his chin was clean-shaven. Let's go, he said, reaching out to close the door and, in the same motion, slipping the broken wooden comb from the table into his sleeve pocket. I didn't call him out on it. The Meng residence was indeed magnificent. 3 banquet tables were set up in the front hall. Meng Wantong sat in the seat of honor, wearing a silver and red brocaded jacket today, her head adorned with pearls and jade that glinted dazzlingly in the sunlight. When she saw me enter, she paused for a moment, probably not expecting me to be without my laundry apron, then gave a little laugh and covered half her face with a folding fan. "Well, look who's here." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over me as if she were examining a piece of porcelain with a chip in it. Miss Zhou is indeed straightforward. "Attendant, show Miss Zhou to her seat." She paused for a moment, lowered her round fan, and revealed the innocent, smiling face beneath it. "Just sit on that low stool by the door. I'm afraid you'll feel too self-conscious at the main table." The low stool by the door was half as tall as the chairs the others were sitting on. Sitting on it felt like crouching, and I couldn't even reach the tabletop. A few young ladies in silk blouses nearby giggled, covering their mouths. One of them held a handkerchief up to her face, her cheeks flushed red with laughter. Meng sat in the seat of honor, picked up her teacup, took a sip, and let her gaze sweep over me, as if I were an object out of place. "Please don't take this the wrong way, Miss Zhou. I came in a hurry today and didn't have time to set up more tables and chairs." She set down her teacup and tapped her fingertips leisurely against the edge of the table. "I hear you make your living doing laundry in Yong'an Alley? That must be quite tiring. I've always been sympathetic to servants. Why don't you stay at the Meng residence and take on a position?" Before she could finish speaking, footsteps could be heard coming from the side porch, neither fast nor slow. Helan Jin walked over from the moon-shaped archway, carrying a plate of osmanthus cakes. His indigo-blue robe had faded to a pale white in the sunlight, yet he held his back straight and walked with steady steps. When he reached the table, he set the plate down at the corner and tilted his head to glance at the low stool. "Miss Meng," he said, his voice neither too loud nor too soft, just loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, "the doorman just mentioned that the spring banquet was set up with an atemoral's table. Why is there an extra low stool here? I suspect the servants must have set it up incorrectly." The table fell silent. The smile on Meng Wantao's face froze for a split second, then quickly returned. She tilted her head to look at Helan Jin, set down her teacup, and slowly traced a circle around the rim with her fingertip. "You are Helan Jin." He gave a slight nod, his manners impeccable yet without a trace of subservience. "I'm the letter copier from Yong'an Alley. Brother Jingxing asked me a few days ago to copy a copy of the Book of Southern Flower *, so I'm dropping it off today since I was in the neighborhood." As soon as he said that, the expressions of several young ladies at the table changed. Since Meng Jingxing had personally commissioned someone to transcribe the book, that person must have had a close relationship with the Meng family. Meng Wanhong twirled her round fan in her hand, a smile still playing at the corners of her mouth, though it had grown faint. "I see," she said. "Since your brother Jingxing's guest, then, someone, bring another chair for young Master Helan." Helan Jin didn't move. "There's no rush about the chair." He glanced down at the low stool, then bent over with the utmost naturalness, pulled it out, and replaced it with an empty round stool from beside it, placing it behind me. He did this with such ease, as if he were simply smoothing out the tablecloth. "Miss Zhou, please sit here," he said. Silence fell over the table. The teacups held by the young ladies remained suspended in midair. Meng Wanhong stared at the round stool for a few moments, let out a soft laugh, and once again covered half her face with her folding fan. "Young Master Helan certainly seems quite taken with Miss Zhou." She tilted her head, her gaze peering out from above the fan. "May I ask who you two are?" "Neighbors," said Helan Jin. His reply came so quickly, it seemed as if he'd prepared it in advance. But I knew that wasn't the case. As he spoke, his eyelashes were lowered, his gaze resting on the plate of osmanthus cakes on the table, his eyes as still as a pool of stagnant water. Meng Wanhong must have sensed the coldness in his tone as well. She stopped smiling and adopted a more casual, conversational tone. "I see. How long has Miss Zhou been living in Yong'an Alley? I've heard that neighborhood is a mixed bag. It must be quite difficult for a young woman like you to make a living there." As she spoke, she slipped a silver bracelet off her wrist, set it on the table, and nudged it toward me. The bracelet was polished to a shine and engraved with a band of intertwined lotus vines. It was of decent quality. This is my first time meeting Miss Zhou, and I don't have much to offer. Although this bracelet isn't worth much, it might serve as a nice addition to Miss Zhou's dowry. She phrased it politely, but I could tell, presenting a silver bracelet to a laundress at the spring banquet in front of all those noble young ladies was nothing but charity. She wanted to pin me down as a servant in full view of everyone, including Helan Jin. I looked at the silver bracelet, which lay in the center of the table, glinting blindingly in the sunlight. The eyes of several young ladies nearby were fixed on me, waiting to see how I would handle the situation. If I reached out to take it, I would be confirming my inferior status. If I didn't, I would be snubbing the Meng family's daughter. Helan Jin stood beside me, motionless. But I sensed that his hand, hanging by his sleeve, had shifted an inch toward me, his knuckles slightly bent, as if preparing to block something. I didn't look at that bracelet. I rolled up my sleeve halfway, revealing a faint pink gold scar on the inside of my wrist, about an inch long, as if left by a sharp object. The scar stood out clearly in the sunlight. "That's very kind of you, Miss Meng," I said, keeping my wrist raised but tilting it slightly so that the silver glow from the bracelet fell directly on my old scar. "It's just that ever since I was a child, I've been allergic to silver. I break out in a rash the moment it touches my skin. Years ago, Aunt Zhou made me a pair of silver pendants. After wearing them for half a day, my wrist became inflamed, leaving the scar." I paused for a moment, then pulled my sleeve down to cover the scar. "I'm afraid I'm not worthy of Miss Meng's bracelet." The table was so quiet you could hear the wind blowing through the corridor. The smile on Meng Wantong's face finally slipped away, and the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. She stared at my hand as I lowered my sleeve, as if she wanted to say something, but that silver bracelet was still sitting in the center of the table. Pulling back something you've already pushed out makes a louder sound than a slap. Helan Jin's lips twitched slightly at my side, then snapped back into place almost instantly. "Since Miss Zhou cannot tolerate silverware," he began, his voice steady and unhurried, as if discussing a trivial matter, "perhaps Miss Meng should choose something else. That bracelet is of fine quality. Accepting it would be to go against Miss Meng's wishes, but refusing it might irritate her skin." He turned his head toward Meng Wantong and smiled slightly. "Miss Meng is always so considerate. I imagine she wouldn't want to put her guests in an awkward position." He phrased it gently, but I could tell, he'd replaced the word reward with hospitality and charity with gesture of goodwill. If Meng Wantong were to take the bracelet back now, it would actually make her look like she'd failed to treat her guest properly and was at a loss for how to handle the situation. Meng Wantong set down her round fan, the hand resting on the table clenched briefly before relaxing. "I was a bit thoughtless." She smiled, picking up the silver bracelet and slipping it back onto her wrist, a motion so slow that the knuckles turned slightly white. "As for Miss Zhou's old injury, I was indeed too forward." She changed the subject and smiled again. "Come to think of it, the day before yesterday I came across an old illustrated guide to flowers and birds from a previous dynasty. There's a bird in it I've never seen before. It looks like a crane, yet isn't quite one. Miss Zhou, you're so knowledgeable. Perhaps you could take a look and tell me what kind of bird it is?" She gave the maid a nod, and the maid turned to fetch a scroll, which she laid out on the table. The moment it was unrolled, I saw a glint flash in her eyes, like a cat that had finally sealed off a mouse hole. That painting within a painting was certainly no flower and bird album. It's clearly a detailed erotic painting. The moment the scroll unfurled, the teacups held by several young ladies at the table came to a sudden halt. The girl in the pale yellow blouse sitting next to Meng Wantong abruptly turned her face away. Her ears flushed crimson, and she clenched the handkerchief in her hand into a tight ball. A perfectly natural look of surprise flashed across Meng Wantong's face. She covered her mouth with her folding fan, her voice tinged with a smile. "Oh my, I picked up the wrong one. These are loose paintings the steward collected the day before yesterday. I accidentally slipped them into the flower and bird album. Please don't take offense, Miss Zhou." Although she said she picked up the wrong one, her hand remained pressed against one end of the scroll, showing no sign of letting go. Her gaze pierced through the top of the fan like a soft thorn, pricking him without causing any real pain or discomfort. Miss Zhou has lived in Yong'an Alley all these years, so she's seen quite a bit of what goes on in the streets, she said with a smile, her voice neither too loud nor too soft, just loud enough for everyone at the table to hear clearly. A painting like this is probably nothing out of the ordinary. Why don't you take a look for us? Which painter from the previous dynasty created it? The silence at the table was like a taut drumhead, the slightest touch would set it ringing. The young ladies kept their heads bowed, but out of the corners of their eyes, they were all fixed on the painting, waiting to see how I would react. I looked down at the painting. The brushwork was meticulous, but the colors were garish and tacky, clearly the sort of thing sold for a few cash coins at a street-side art shop. In my previous life, I lived on Yong'an Alley for 3 years, and the owner of the art shop at the entrance would bring out these kinds of paintings to sell every few days. I'd seen far more than just 1 or 2 of them. The brushwork is rough, and the colors are garish, I said, shifting my gaze from the painting to the surface of Meng Wantong's round fan. The brushstrokes follow the standard techniques of mass-produced folk art. There's no pressure from the fingertips, so the colors aren't held down and the lines aren't covered. I paused for a moment. Paintings like these cost just a few in a stack at the art shop, they're sold by the Jin. Someone at the table let out a soft ah, then quickly stifled it. Meng Wantong's hand holding the folding fan froze for a moment, and the edge of the fan tapped against the tabletop, making a soft tap sound. I'm not just making this up. In my past life, Helan Jin ran a stall in Yong'an Alley where he wrote letters for people. Right next door was an art shop, and I delivered paper and ink for him a few times. I saw the shop owner stockpiling these paintings in stacks upon stacks. He bought them for 3 won each and sold them to street vendors for 5 won. To the nobility, these were considered trash, but to the common folk, they were simply a means of making a living. Meng Wantong deliberately chose this erotic painting to shut me up. She thought I'd be embarrassed, flustered, and at a loss for words. She didn't expect me to recognize it, and she certainly didn't expect me to dismiss it as worthless right in front of everyone at the table. A crack finally appeared in the smile on her face. Miss Zhou certainly knows a lot. She slowly rolled up the scroll, pressing down on the paper with her fingertips so hard that her knuckles turned white. It seems you really have seen a lot of the world out there. I've seen a few, I said. If Miss Meng would like to purchase a painting, the art shop on West Street carries authentic Gombe-style flower and bird paintings with sparse compositions and translucent colors in ink. This kind. I took a look at the scroll she was holding. Goods sold by the Jin like this would probably get Miss Meng's hands dirty. Someone at the table couldn't hold it in and let out a laugh, a short, sharp chuckle, as if she choked on her tea. Meng Wantong turned her head and glared at her. The girl quickly lowered her head, but her shoulders were still trembling slightly. Helan Jin stood beside me. He hadn't spoken a word since a moment ago. But I could feel him shift half a step closer to me, his sleeve brushing against the back of my chair like a thin barrier. Meng Wantong handed the scroll to her maid, and a smile returned to her face, though it was so thin you could see right through it, unable to hide any of the emotions beneath. Miss Zhou really is quick-witted. She lowered her round fan and rested it on her lap, her fingers interlaced. I'm afraid my hospitality was lacking today. Once I've acquired a fine painting, I'll invite you back to admire it. She was just being polite, but she dragged out the last syllable, as if she were slowly grinding over something. Others might not have noticed, but I did. She was implying that I'd embarrassed her today, and that this matter wasn't over yet. I stood up and gave her a slight nod. Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Meng. It's getting late, so I'll take my leave now. Helan Jin bowed slightly toward her without saying a word, then stepped aside half a step to let me go first. As we left the Meng residence, the setting sun was already low in the west at the end of the alley. We walked side by side for a while, neither of us speaking. It wasn't until we turned the corner and the silhouette of that small palanquin with its blue canopy was out of sight that Helan Jin stopped and turned his head to look at me. There was something indescribable in that gaze, something heavy, as if it were weighing down on something. You just said that kind of painting is sold by the Jin, he said, his voice neither too loud nor too soft. Have you ever seen one? Of course I've seen them. In my past life, he ran a stall next to the art supply store, and when I was helping him close up shop, I saw the store owner stuff these things into a box. He knew, of course, he was right there, but at the time, he kept his head down, his ears as red as boiled shrimp, and didn't say a word. On West Street, I said, right next to the shop where you set up your stall. He was silent for a moment. I didn't notice, he said. But something flashed in his eyes, he had clearly just remembered. I didn't call him out on it. I just lifted my foot and kept walking. Behind me, his footsteps followed, steady and unhurried, always maintaining a half-step's distance. At the entrance to Yong'an Alley, Aunt Zhou was taking in the clothes that had been hanging on a bamboo pole. When she saw us coming back, one in front of the other, she gave me a wink. Xing, she leaned in and whispered, someone came looking for you a moment ago, a steward from the Meng household, and left a message, the spring banquet isn't over yet. You've got a long road ahead of you, young lady. She imitated that phrase perfectly, drawing out the last syllable. I listened and nodded. Helan Jin walked up behind me, stood beside me, and tilted his head to glance toward the entrance of the alley. As long as it's not over, he said. The voice was light and airy, as if it were saying, the weather's nice today. 2 days later, another note arrived from the Meng household. This time, it was delivered by an unfamiliar old woman, who simply shoved the note into my hand and left without saying a word. I opened it and found only a single line, meet me at the west corner gate tomorrow afternoon. The signature features a branch of crabapple blossoms, rendered with deep, bleeding ink and extremely heavy brushstrokes. I recognized this handwriting. In my past life, when Meng Jingxing asked me to meet him at West Corner Gate, he used the same kind of paper and ink, even the length of the final stroke of the character Xiang is exactly the same. Meng Wandan used one of Meng Jingxing's old sheets of paper to write this letter. She thought I wouldn't notice, assuming that when I saw the signature Hai Tang, I would assume it was an invitation from her. But in my past life, before the poison wine had burned through my internal organs, as Meng Jingxing signed the divorce papers by candlelight, the final stroke of the character Jing was drawn as short as possible, so hastily, as if he were flinging away something scalding hot. The next afternoon, I left the house with the letter tucked away. Helan Jin wasn't there. Aunt Zhou said he'd gone to the bookstore on the west side of town early that morning to copy a scripture for someone and wouldn't be back until dark. I left the letter under the dressing table and, as usual, headed out toward the west corner gate. The west corner gate was a side entrance to the alley behind the Meng mansion. It was normally used by the servants, and the bluestone pavement had been polished smooth by the constant passage of water buckets. When I arrived, the gate was ajar, and a corner of a deep blue robe was visible through the crack. Meng Jingxing leaned against the doorframe, twirling a folding fan in his hand. Its ribs were made of rosewood, which glistened with a rich luster in the sunlight. He heard footsteps and looked up, his face breaking into that smile I had seen countless times in my past life, gentle and serene, like a piece of jade that had been polished for many years, without a single flaw. Miss Sue. He closed his folding fan and gave me a slight nod. I apologize for asking you to come here on such short notice, but there is something I'd really like to ask you in person. I stopped 3 steps away and didn't go any closer. Young Master Meng, please speak. He smiled slightly, shifted the fan to his left hand, and tapped the doorframe twice lightly with the tips of his right fingers. The gesture was so natural, yet as I watched it, it felt as if something had scraped against my heart. In our past life, he would always tap twice like that whenever he had something to discuss, as if he were rolling the words around on the tip of his tongue a couple of times before finally letting them out. Wan Tang, did she do anything inappropriate at the spring appreciation banquet a few days ago? He asked. I heard from a maid that she brought out a painting that wasn't meant to be displayed, which put Miss Sue in an awkward position. It wasn't a bother at all, I said. Miss Meng was kind enough to host me. It's just that I'm not well-traveled enough to recognize fine things. He narrowed his eyes slightly. Miss Sue, there's no need for you to cover for her. He changed his tone. The smile on his face faded slightly, revealing just the right amount of remorse. Wan Tang has been spoiled by my mother and sometimes acts disrespectfully. I've already spoken to her about it. He took half a step toward me and tapped the folding fan lightly against the palm of his hand. If Miss Zhou doesn't mind, I'll prepare a meal another day to make amends. Just the two of us, with no one else to disturb us. As he said this, his gaze rested on my face, warm, like a bowl of tea that was neither too hot nor too cold. In my past life, I was deceived by that very gaze. I thought he truly cared for me and was willing to rescue me from that dilapidated house on Yong'an Alley. But what happened afterward? When the poisoned wine was brought to my lips, his eyes were just as warm as ever as he looked at me, without saying a single word. "You're too kind, young Master Meng," I said, taking a half step back. "There's no bad blood between Miss Meng and me, so there's no need for an apology. If there's nothing else at your residence, I'll take my leave now." His folding fan came to a stop. "Miss Zhou," he called out to me, the warmth in his voice fading slightly to reveal a chill beneath the surface. "I've heard that Helan Jin has been spending a lot of time with you these past few days. As for him, his background isn't clean. He grew up on the streets, and he won't amount to much in the future." He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping slowly over my face. "Miss Zhou, you're young, don't let a momentary act of kindness blind you." His words were spoken with the utmost concern, as if an older brother were admonishing an immature younger sister. But I understood, he had emphasized the word suit. He was telling me that Helan Jin's background wasn't good enough for me, and that only his family, the Meng family, was worthy of my attention. "You're right, young Master Meng," I said. "I am indeed young, and sometimes I don't recognize people." I gave a slight bow. "I've never been good at judging people. I wasn't good at it before, but I'll be more careful from now on." I said it lightly, but I knew he understood. In my past life, it was precisely because I had poor judgment in people that I cast one last glance at his gentle eyes just before I died. He said I was young. He said Helan Jin came from a shady background. He told me not to let a moment's kindness blind me, yet in that past life, when he stood beside me watching the Meng family's servants chase and beat Helan Jin, he never once spoke up. Meng Jingxing paused for a moment with his hand on the folding fan, then smiled. "That's good to hear. Since Miss Zhou knows what she's doing, I can rest easy." He turned and walked toward the door, his dark blue robe sweeping over the threshold. Just as the door was about to close, he turned his face slightly and raised his folding fan, nodding in my direction. "By the way, Helan Jin went to the bookstore on the west side of town today to copy a Buddhist sutra. But I remember that he keeps his brush rest on his left side." The door closed. I stood in the alley outside the west corner gate, the sun beating down on my back, making me feel hot. Those words felt like a fine needle, gently pricking the back of my neck. Meng Jingxing told me that he had looked into Helan Jin. He knew which side Helan Jin usually kept his pen on, and he knew where Helan Jin had gone and what he'd been doing today. He tossed this information at me casually, and the implication was clear: he was keeping an eye on Helan Jin, and he knew I cared about him. What he didn't know, however, was that what he had just said, Helan Jin went to the bookstore in the western part of the city today, matched word for word what Helan Jin had told me before he left: "I'm going to the bookstore in the western part of the city." Yet last night, while Helan Jin was copying sutras at the table, I clearly saw him use his left hand to refill his inkwell. He switched hands. He told me he had gone to the bookstore, but deliberately used his left hand to dip the brush in ink so that someone would notice. I turned and walked back, taking my time. The sun was sinking in the west, and the eaves of Yong'an Alley cast a long shadow behind me. Helan Jin probably hadn't come back yet. The pot of congee on the stove was still warm. But that string in my heart loosened just a little. It was like a string that had been taut for too long, suddenly given a gentle pluck. Meng Jingxing was investigating him. But Helan Jin was making sure Meng Jingxing uncovered exactly what he wanted him to find. Separated by a wall, the two men were engaged in a game of one-upmanship, while Meng Wandong remained unaware that her brother had already shifted his attention away from her. A figure was crouching at the entrance to the alley, wearing an indigo-blue straight-cut robe that glowed with a washed-out whiteness in the sunlight. Helan Jin looked up at me and held up the oil paper wrapper he was holding. I bought half a gene of osmanthus cake, he said. I got back early, so I haven't started cooking yet. The sun shone on his face, and beneath that aloof facade, the corners of his mouth turned up ever so slightly. Just as the sun was sinking low over the eaves, messengers from the Meng household arrived. They were neither an elderly housekeeper nor a maid, but 3 burly retainers dressed in short, loose-fitting brown robes cinched at the waist. Each clutched a short staff that reached up to their eyebrows, and as they stood at the entrance to the alley, they blocked half the path. The leader took a step forward and nodded toward me. Miss Zhou, the matriarch would like to see you. Aunt Zhou's clothesline pole clattered to the ground. She tugged at my sleeve and took half a step back, her lips trembling as she said, Heng, who are you people? How can you treat a guest like this? The servant ignored Aunt Zhou and slammed the short stick he was holding down on the ground. The matriarch said to invite only Miss Zhou. No one else should meddle. I patted Aunt Zhou on the back of her hand and gently pried her trembling fingers away from her sleeve. It's okay, Aunt Zhou. I'll be right back. As I walked forward, the 3 servants formed a triangle, trapping me in the middle. A small palanquin made of blue tweed was parked at the entrance to the alley. The curtain was drawn, so I couldn't see who was inside. One of the servants lifted the curtain and nodded toward the interior, get in. As the palanquin was carried toward the back gate of the Meng residence, I ran through my memories of Lady Meng from my previous life. Her surname was Helan. She was the daughter of a concubine in the Helan family. After marrying into the Meng household, she served as the matriarch for 40 years. She was tough and shrewd, and she doted on Meng Wanzhong, her privileged granddaughter, as if she were the apple of her eye, because Meng Wanzhong was the face that upheld the family's prestige. But she didn't know that Meng Wanzhong's dignity was stolen. The palanquin came to a stop, the servant lifted the curtain, and I stepped down onto the ground. Before me was a small hall in the rear courtyard of the Meng residence. The furnishings were simple and unadorned. A rosewood screen blocked half the doorway, and seated behind it was an elderly woman wearing a gray-brown jacket. Her hair was combed with meticulous care, and she held a cup of tea in her hands, not drinking it, but simply cradling it there. I walked in, stopped 3 steps away from the screen, and bowed slightly. Greetings, madam. Lady Meng didn't look up. She gently scraped the foam off the surface of her tea 3 times with the lid before setting it down. Are you Su Heng? Yes. She set the teacup down on the low table beside her, moving so gently that she didn't even brush against the porcelain saucer on the table. That girl Wantang was being a bit reckless the other day. She invited you to the spring banquet, and I heard things didn't go quite smoothly, she said, her voice steady and measured, like someone who'd spent a lifetime working hard, with a sense of propriety in both her words and actions. I asked you to come so I could apologize to you in person. I glanced at her. She was saying she was sorry, but her eyes, peering out from beneath her gray-brown eyelids, were steady and cold, clearly sizing me up. She wasn't really apologizing. She was just trying to figure out if I was worth her trouble. You're too kind, madam, I said. Miss Meng was very hospitable. There was nothing to be dissatisfied with. She didn't respond. After a brief pause, she looked away from my face and gazed out the window at the old locust tree. What's your mother's last name? My heart skipped a beat. Why was she asking this? In my past life, she had never asked me about my mother. My last name is Xia, I said. That was the truth, my mother's last name really was Xia. She died of an illness when I was 6, and after that, I went to live with Aunt Zhou. Lady Meng asked no further questions. She simply reached into her sleeve, pulled out a pouch, and set it on the table. It was made of dark red satin, embroidered with silver thread, and bulged as if it were filled with something. Here, she said. Don't have anything to do with Wan Tao from now on. She has a hot temper and is prone to hurting people. I didn't take that pouch. Her words sounded like an offer of compensation, but I knew what she meant. If I accepted this bag of silver, I'd have to put up with whatever Meng Wantao did from now on, because I'd already accepted the Meng family's kindness. She understood this calculation better than anyone else. "Madam," I said, "whether Miss Meng has a hot temper or not has nothing to do with me. I'm just a laundress. The Meng household is exclusive, and I never intended to visit often anyway." I paused for a moment. "Please take this purse back, madam. Though I am poor, I don't need others to cover the costs of Miss Meng's hot temper." Lady Meng's eyelids fluttered slightly, and her gaze grew even colder. She didn't lose her temper, but during those few moments of silence, the room was as quiet as a dry well. "You really do have a stubborn streak." She withdrew her hand, leaving the pouch sitting untouched on the table. "Never mind. Go on then. It won't do you any harm to stay out of the Meng family's affairs from now on." I bowed slightly and turned toward the door. When I reached the folding screen, I paused and turned my face to the side. "The old lady's surname is Helan. She's a daughter of the Helan family, isn't she?" There was no sound from behind the screen, yet the hand resting on the table curled its knuckles ever so slightly. "How did you know?" "I heard about it," I said. "Years ago, the Helan family had an illegitimate daughter who married into the Meng family. The old lady must be her." I didn't say anything else. I just got up and walked out the door. By the time I returned to Yong'an Alley, dusk was already falling. Helan Jin was crouched by the doorway, still peeling the wax paper off that half-gene of osmanthus cake. When he saw me come back, he set the paper wrapper aside and stood up. "Is someone from the Meng family looking for you?" "Mrs. Meng," I said. He didn't ask what the old lady had said. He just looked at my empty hand. "My wallet was confiscated?" I glanced at him. Did he know about the wallet, too? How did he find out? "Confiscated," I said. He gave a slight smile, broke off half of the flattened osmanthus cake from the rice paper wrapper, and handed it to me. "Go ahead and eat," he said. "It's cold, but it's still edible." I took it and took a bite. The sweetness of the osmanthus blossoms melted on my tongue. The evening breeze from the end of the alley swept between us. The shadows of those three servants had long since faded, and Yong'an Alley had returned to its usual self. But I know that Mrs. Meng probably won't sleep soundly tonight. Because her surname is Helan, and her beloved granddaughter, Meng Wantao, doesn't have a single drop of Helan blood running through her veins. Helan Jin crouched down beside me, bent his head, and took a bite of the osmanthus cake. "The weather will be nice tomorrow," he said. "Let's air out the bedding." When Eunuch stepped into the side hall, he was holding a rosewood box in his hands. The palace banquet had been underway for most of the day. The singing and dancing had concluded 3 times, 5 rounds of wine had been served, and nearly everything that needed to be said had been said. Meng Wantong sat at the head of the women's table, wearing a pomegranate red brocaded court gown today. A circle of fine Eastern pearls around the neckline accentuated her slender neck, as if she already knew something in advance. She knew that today was the day the palace would grant her an official title. Half a month ago, Lady Meng had sent a token into the palace, requesting that the Empress bestow a title upon Meng Wantong to recognize the Meng family's loyalty, filial piety, and devotion to the household. The Empress had agreed, and the imperial edict was to be announced publicly at today's palace banquet. Meng Wantong's fingertips tapped lightly on the edge of the table, one tap after another, unable to stop herself. Eunuch came to a halt, placed the wooden box on the low table beside the imperial desk, and did not open it immediately. He first bowed to the Empress, then gave a slight nod in the direction of Lady Meng, before pulling the bright yellow silk scroll from his sleeve. The hall fell silent. Miss Meng, a late-blooming peony, is gentle, graceful, and dignified, and excels in the duties of a wife and mother. Eunuch's voice, neither too loud nor too soft, echoed among the beams and columns of the inner hall. She is hereby conferred the title of Lady of Qinghe County, and is granted a golden scroll and a jade tablet. So ordered. Meng Wantong stood up, unable to hide the smile on her face. She curtsied and, as she accepted the silk scroll with both hands, her fingertips trembled slightly. "Thank you, Your Majesty, for your kindness." She turned and walked toward the women's section of the hall, where the ladies and young misses throughout the hall rose one after another to offer their congratulations. Some praised her graceful demeanor. Others remarked that her court attire made her look even more radiant today. Still others took her hand and exchanged polite pleasantries. The hall was bustling with activity, as if it were in an uproar. I was sitting at the end of the women's table, with a plate of untouched pastries in front of me. Helan Jin sat in the very back row of the men's section. His indigo blue straight-cut robe stood out strikingly among the sea of brocaded robes and satin garments. He had accompanied Meng to the banquet today, ostensibly to appraise and acquire paintings on Meng Jingxing's behalf. Meng Jingxing had likely intended to keep him close by to keep an eye on him, but he hadn't anticipated that Helan Jin would scrutinize the entire palace banquet from start to finish. "Eunuch De hasn't left yet." He placed the wooden box beside the Empress and whispered something to her. The Empress's hand, holding the teacup, paused for a moment. She set the cup down and shifted her gaze from the bright yellow silk scroll to Eunuch De's face. "Really? Your Highness, this humble servant would not dare to speak without cause." Eunuch De took a half-step back, lifted the lid of the rosewood box just a crack, and took out a jade pendant. The jade pendant was about half the size of a palm. Carved from milky white jade, it depicted an auspicious crane holding a lingxi mushroom in its beak. There was a very faint crack at the base of the crane's head, as if it had been left by something that had been clenched tightly. Eunuch De held the jade pendant in both hands, walked around the hall once to show it to everyone present, and finally stopped at the end of the men's seating area. It came to a stop in front of Helan Jin. The lively atmosphere in the hall was suddenly doused with a bucket of cold water, and in an instant silence fell. Meng Wanton still had a smile on her face, but it had turned stiff. She glanced at the jade pendant in Eunuch De's hand, then at Helan Jin, and parted her lips slightly, but no sound came out. Eunuch De bent down and held the jade pendant out in front of Helan Jin. His voice was neither too loud nor too soft, yet everyone in the hall could hear him clearly. "Young Master Helan, may I ask if you've ever seen this jade pendant?" Helan Jin looked down at the jade. His expression remained largely unchanged, but the look in his eyes grew deeper, as if light had suddenly shone into a deep well. "I've seen it," he said. "It's a memento from my mother." Someone in the hall gasped. Eunuch De nodded, straightened up, and turned toward the imperial desk. "Your Imperial Majesty, this humble servant has been investigating for 3 months. It is true that a baby boy was switched at the Helan household all those years ago. The one who was taken away was sold to Yong'an Alley and raised by a widow surnamed Sun, that is this young Master Helan. As for the girl who remained at the Helan household," he paused for a moment, then shifted his gaze toward the women's section, where it settled on Meng Wanton. "She was a baby girl the Sun family found outside the city walls all those years ago. She impersonated the Helan family's legitimate daughter and enjoyed 16 years of luxury and privilege." Meng Wanton's face went pale in an instant. She was still clutching the golden scroll in her hand so tightly that her knuckles had turned blue. She opened her mouth, her voice rising to a shrill pitch, "Nonsense. You're lying. Your Highness, this eunuch is making slanderous accusations. I am the legitimate daughter of the Helan family. My mother said so herself." "Your mother?" the Empress asked. Her voice was neither hurried nor slow, yet it silenced the entire hall. "Your mother, Lady Helan, suffered a difficult labor and hemorrhaged 16 years ago. She passed away 3 days after giving birth. What could she possibly have told you in person?" Meng Wanton's lips trembled as she took half a step back. Her heel bumped against the table leg, causing her to stagger slightly. Lady Meng sat on the mat. From the moment Eunuch De produced the jade pendant, the color drained from her face bit by bit, and her grayish-brown robe made her complexion look like a sheet of old paper. She stared in the direction of Helan Jin, her gaze fixed on the sheep's fat white jade. Her lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. She was the daughter of the Helan family. She recognized that piece of jade, the token of the Helan family's eldest son. There was a crack in the crane's head, left when the old family head clutched it as he drew his last breath. 16 years had passed, and she thought the jade had been buried along with that dead infant girl. Apparently not. It turns out that it had been lying there for 16 years alongside this living baby boy in a dilapidated house on Yong'an Alley. Wantang, Lady Meng finally spoke, her voice as dry and hoarse as a leaf parched by the autumn wind. Come here. Meng Wantang didn't move. She stood by the table, her shoulders trembling slightly. Her pomegranate red court robe stood out starkly against the silence that filled the hall. Her gaze shifted from the jade pendant to Helan Jin's face, then from Helan Jin's face to Lady Meng's. Her lips moved several times before she finally managed to utter a single sentence. Grandma, I don't know him. I don't know anything about the Helan family. I'm not. Come here, Lady Meng repeated, her gaunt fingers clenching the edge of the table, her fingernails digging into the wood grain. Meng Wantang finally made a move. She walked step by step toward the old lady. Meng knelt down before her, clutched her sleeve, and said in a voice so trembling it was about to break, Grandmother, believe me, please believe me. Lady Meng looked down at her. Her gaunt hand rose and rested on Meng Wantang's head, patting it gently. Then she withdrew her hand, took the silver bracelet with the intertwined lotus pattern from her sleeve, and placed it on the table. Someone, she said, her voice hoarse but steady, take her to the inner chambers. Don't alarm Her Highness or the other ladies. Meng Wantang knelt on the ground, staring at the silver bracelet that had been set down before her and watching as the old lady Meng turned away from her. Suddenly, she let out a very brief, piercing sob. Two maids stepped forward to seize her arms, half dragging, half pulling her toward the inner chambers. The hem of her pomegranate red court gown trailed along the floor, like a pool of spilled rouge. No one in the hall spoke. The Empress picked up her teacup, took a sip, set it down, and looked in the direction of Helan Jin. Is your name Helan Jin? Yes. When did you start wearing that jade? 3 years old, said Helan Jin, his voice as still as a calm lake. Before she died, my mother sewed it into the lining of my undershirt and told me, this is what my father left for me. He didn't say foster mother. He said my mother. As he spoke those 2 words, his eyelashes drooped, his gaze fixed on the tips of his shoes, as if he were speaking to someone who had long since passed away. The Empress was silent for a moment, then nodded slightly. The palace will certainly investigate the matter concerning the Helan family. As for the Meng family's false claim to be related to a government official, that is a crime of deceiving the emperor. She paused for a moment and glanced in the direction of Lady Meng. Lady Meng had already risen to her feet. Her grayish-brown figure stood out like a withered tree amid the brocades filling the hall. She knelt in the direction of the imperial desk, pressing her forehead against the cold floor tiles. I failed to judge character properly, and I am ashamed before the ancestors of the Helan family. The Meng family is willing to accept full responsibility for this, but we beg your highness, please spare Wantang's life. After she said that, she didn't lift her head again. As Lady Meng bowed, the jewels, jade, and silk brocades filling the hall seemed to lose their luster. Eunuch De, holding the rosewood box, stepped aside and gently placed the jade pendant on the table beside Helan Jin, saying nothing more. The banquet came to an end. On the stone steps outside the palace gate, Helan Jin walked ahead of me, the hem of his indigo-blue robe fluttering gently in the night breeze. The moonlight cast a long shadow behind him. As it fell across the stone steps, it split into separate strands, resembling the shape of the old scar on the back of his neck. I stopped. He stopped too, without looking back. Helan Jin. He turned his face slightly, and the moonlight illuminated half of it. The expression in his eyes was a little fainter than on the night they first met, yet it had grown deeper, like a fire that had burned for a long time and had finally burned down to its embers. You shouldn't have come, I said. From now on, you're the legitimate son of the Helan family. Your status is even higher than that of the Meng family. As for me, I'm just a laundress. Su Heng. He interrupted me, his voice so soft it seemed to swirl like a leaf in the night breeze. Are you still going to the West Market to do laundry tomorrow? I was taken aback for a moment. Go. He turned around, took a step forward, and placed the boxwood comb, with 2 missing teeth, into the palm of my hand. Then I'll go back to setting up my stall at the bridgehead, he said. I make a little more copying sutras than writing letters, so I'll be able to add a couple more handfuls of rice to my porridge from now on. I looked down at the wooden comb in the palm of my hand. He had sanded down the broken teeth with fine sandpaper. It felt smooth to the touch and didn't prick my fingers. Outside the palace walls, the night watchman struck the gong to mark the 3rd watch. The sound carried from afar, once, then again. All right. I tucked the wooden comb into my sleeve and started walking down the stairs. I'd like something thick tomorrow. He gave a slight smile and followed, still keeping a half step behind. It's too thick, he said. I won't be adding the osmanthus cake. That's the end of the story. Thank you all for sticking with me. See you in the next post.